Now, we don't have a topic for the roundtable, but I think this is a wonderful opportunity to discuss some of the themes that have been running through what I think has been a very, very engaging set of conversations over the last day and a half. Moral meaning of intellectual life. I think this is something we heard about certainly this morning, but also on other occasions. I think we've tried to, think through some of the questions around, old institutions, new technologies. I think there's been a lot of questions around the shape and form of political and economic power. I think there's been questions around agency and accountability. I mean, there's a whole lot of things that has been discussed. The role of religion in building institutions and communities, as well as many more. So I just want to throw it open to the audience, because you've not always had a chance to ask questions, but then also give a chance to the panelists to debate with one another. So, who would like to? Someone really doesn't seem very interested in proceedings.
It's my first comment.
I
wisest one of the day.
I wonder who puts on the panel. Who would like to ask the first question?
So with regards to sort of the moral status and role of intellectuals and the attempt to create a greater ability to sort of interface with the larger public, the potential of various social media formats and other kinds of new media distribution seem to both present an opportunity, but also a chance for intellectual life to be lost. As you said, you happened to pick up Chomsky right as a young man, but there were a lot of gatekeepers that meant that there was not necessarily a wide variety of things that you could have picked up instead, right? But the contemporary environment instead produces a profusion of intellectual, pseudo-intellectual, popular options, even if you're interested in learning more about politics. So just from all of your perspectives, what are some of the ways in which the changing media environment, the changing information exposure environment to new generations of activists, thinkers, potential activists and thinkers can be utilized or not utilized or impact these ideas?
It's interesting. I actually asked that question to some young people. I live in Boston. My wife teaches at Harvard, and we do a lot of work with young people. And I was sitting down with a Harvard junior, very, very bright kid, very, very smart kid. He'll go off, to Harvard B School, Morgan Stanley, da-da-da-da. And I had one of the most extraordinary experiences. We're sitting here talking, very, very bright kid, and he says to me, he pulls out his iPhone and he says, if I have to scroll down more than 3 times, it's too long. That thing, I said, that can't be. He said, no. He said, given where we are, and there's such a intergenerational disconnect, which is cavernous. He said, and I said, bring kid. He says, yo, bro, listen, this is where we are. If we've got to scroll down more than 3 times, the document is too long. And I was talking to a Harvard junior faculty person. We were, related conversation. And he talked about how the technological online stuff had retarded an entire generation's ability to absorb significant, powerful amounts of information. And I said, whoa! So I said, let me get this now. So you're telling me as a result of this, tweeting and that, that's sort of the political image, right? 45 tweeting. He says, there's an entire generation that will, in some deep sense, be profoundly anti-intellectual. And the culture, which produced just the disposition and discipline. I mean, because you're right? I mean, Chomsky's American Parallel Mandarin was like a 300-page book. And you sat there, and I lived with the discipline. And then, like I said, I was sort of off the hook with this. I'm going through every footnote. I couldn't do a paragraph of 1 footnote today based on what these young people said. So, and what was important to the question is that it introduced me to a world that if I hadn't sat down with that Harvard undergraduate who's a bright kid, or a Harvard junior faculty person who had gone to Harvard, Oxford, and Yale, and says the intellectual culture technologically is retarded to a degree that adults or we don't understand, or its implications.
Wayne, do you want to comment on this? No. David, I think, had the next question.
Oh, okay. So my question relates to stuff that I've been thinking about and I've been, I guess, expressing about the state, and kind of relates to what you're saying. Because I guess the general question is, what is the role of the state, in mutual aid, right? Because I think there has to be a role of the state, but we have to figure out how to define that. And part of that, though, I think, is the difference between the short version and the long version. Because the short version is the representation. It's the state, it's the authority. It doesn't have to be long. You just have, I don't know, you show the president, you show the king, that's it. That's the representation, right? And you don't need the long explanation. The long explanation, though, is obviously necessary, right? And that's what's kind of, behind the representation, kind of, working all the gears, right? And developing the whole theological apparatus, in a sense. And part of that is that different states are different, and different religions are different. Whatever, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, they're not the same. And if they are all somehow structuring horizontality or participation, it'll probably be doing it in different ways. And I guess I'm wondering how you all see, or how any of you see, that relationship between state and, mutuality.
Marcia.
So I actually come at it the other way, both by training and by current worldview, that the constructions of the state, including constructions of people's relationship to the state or participation in the state or representation by the state, are embedded in, roughly speaking, something we call the large culture, articulated and unarticulated assumptions about the world, the way the world works, the way the world goes down, etc. States don't arrive in spaceships from alien places and plunk themselves down. They come from history and cultural history and so on. So I have been thinking, I mentioned her yesterday once, I have been thinking about Mary Hirschfeld's, I think, excellent point, that we have to address the bathwater, the culture, from which people's ideas about state, representation, action, community, relationship of self to all of the above, they come from a basket of stuff. And that we have to, social media comes into this, but every media comes into this, that this is what needs to be addressed. And the reason, I was thinking about my own participation in this conference, the reason that I'm kind of banging the drum on relationality as distinction amid relation, that is necessary, that's how the species is because that's at the level of cultural assumption, whether it's articulated or not, or whether it's articulated secularly or politically or theistically, etc. And this was the force of my comment to Arya's. People can participate, but with what assumptions about what participation means? With what are assumptions about state, self, community, family, etc., gender, whatever. And I think Hirschfeld is right that people rely on the resources available to them to construct. We are a meaning-making species, and we are a social species, meaning we're a political species. And if people, so it matters a great deal what is available to people to construct the way they understand self and government, self and community, self and family, self and other. And if they don't have something like common good thinking, in its most sophisticated form, people will look for other things that give them meaning, like white supremacist groups and the brotherhood of neo-Nazi organizations. When there was a farm crisis in the 1980s, what were the results? Suicide, drug abuse, spouse abuse, child abuse, and uptick in white supremacist organizations. People look for meaning-making institutions, groups, community, affiliation, and from there they take action.
Thank you. Greg.
There's something that struck me in the whole across the conference, and that's what could be called the tension between analysis in the sense of historical development and actual voluntary, what you can do now. Now, it seems to me that there was a mutual aid moment in Western history around about the 19th century, after the time perhaps when the church stopped doing things like education and welfare and so on. And people did things for themselves. One of the reasons why they had mutual aid was partially because the state couldn't afford to do it as much as anything else. It wasn't that it may not have wanted to do it, it just couldn't do it. So people got together. And then for the best of motives, people introduced the welfare state. They decided it was best if people had things done for them rather than doing it for themselves. And as you rightly pointed out in the paper this morning, the consequence of that is that this eviscerated things like friendly societies, demutualisation, and so on. So we now reach a point where, for the best of motives, for 101 different reasons and different decisions, with powers accreted into various places like the state and business and so on, and everyone's now turning around and say, hey, we can exercise our voluntary capacities and somehow turn the clock back. Now, that strikes me as a historian. History doesn't, when you look at history, it doesn't actually give you any guides at all for doing that sort of action. And I really find it quite utopian that you think that it is possible to turn the clock back and to do things and to reinstitute. I think history tells us that once people actually, particularly in modern society, once they give power to the state and the state's actually doing things for them at a reasonable level, they're quite happy. Most people don't want participation. This comes as a great shock, I know, to most people. They actually don't want to participate. They want to be looked after. And I don't know, it just strikes me as the whole thing is somewhat utopian in wanting to put somehow combine a modern state with a 19th century version of mutual aid.
Okay, are we all utopian? Are we all essentially wanting to, turn the clock back? Which I think, for which another word is reactionary. So this is an interesting situation to be in. Anyone like to?
I'm going to be fairly well. I'm notorious for advocating utopianism, and I'm also notorious for advocating conflictualism. And so I relate to Greg directly because I do, like I, defend the utopian path, but I do see it, as Greg does, as involving conflictualism at every level and no happy outcomes ever. So it's a sort of pessimistic, happy utopianism. But the problem, I think, with Greg's absolutely right, of course, but the problem with our whole discussion is it is not grounded in accurate history of anything. No one at this conference said anything that I thought reflected articles published in the last 12 months about the topic you spoke of. So that is the problem. We talk on mythic history. It's like going to a Liberal Party or a Labour Party meeting and hearing their drivel account of the Middle Ages. Well, we now know there weren't any Middle Ages, and so on and so on. I'd like to focus on the need for accurate history, but I'd also like to stress the need for a rigorous philosophy, and I think this I might agree with Catherine on. I agree with Catherine that anarchism has to be looked at again, and in what I would call a utopian functional way. It doesn't matter what Kropotkin said at 3 o'clock in the morning. What matters is how can these ideas from the past be experiments for real innovations now. I agree with David, they have to be real workable innovations now. I also agree with David that the state is not going to just drop out the window. I think the state's going to get stronger. The evidence from Russia and from Turkey and from India and from China is that we are moving to stronger civilizational-based states. The Western American view of the world is collapsing everywhere because countries that succeed don't do that. And then the worse the US gets, the less they will do it. So I do predict a strong state. Therefore, the anarchist tradition, and Catherine's right about this, becomes urgently more important, because whatever you say against anarchists, they did see the state as a problem, they did see freedom as crucial, and they did see cooperation as the way. And on all of those things, I think they're absolutely right. But there's a bit more truth to be mentioned apart from Piccone. So we have to complicate the story a little bit more. The last thing, and I'll shut up, we really can't have another Telos conference where people talk about America. We really have to click on to the fact that there's a whole planet. In fact, there is a whole universe of many cosmoi. And if we're going to talk about what happened in America and then look complacent about it, frankly, the world's not going to listen. Nobody's interested in Madison outside this country. And the idea that you need a political system following the model of this country, nobody takes seriously anymore, except people in this country. So we really have to engage with the world, and particularly with the new Asia, which is going to be richer, and particularly with the world of Islam, which is not secularizing at all. Turkey correctly has abandoned the errors of Ataturk. Now, we mentioned religion, but we haven't talked about it in every single country in the world, and particularly not in Africa, where the Muslim violence and jihad is succeeding in spreading Islam right across the high hill. So I conclude by saying utopianism is correct, but it has to be pessimistic and conflictual. You do need to look at anarchism. Catherine is completely right about that, but you need hard philosophy, not bunk, and you need global history of an accurate kind. Greg is absolutely right, and it will not give you a happy outcome. It'll be miserable, difficult, and disappointing.
Amen.
And if that hasn't cheered you up, I don't know what will.
Well, it's meant to be cheerful. That was the joke that I was working on.
No, absolutely.
May I say something?
Please, yes, of course.
Personally, I worry a lot about the issue of the commons. And well, anarchists in the beginning, well, they started their tradition by insisting on the importance of something that is common to us all. And this communality, which was about the land, the water, everything that belongs to no one, has been more and more restricted, first by the practice of the enclosures in the 17th century, and then now I've read a terrible article about water, that water is becoming a good, and so some companies were selling water to Australia. And so I think that today, I wonder what remains from the common. I think everything is corporate, I think so. So my question is, how can we speak about communality, about community, mutual aid, if we don't have, a common ground, if I may say so? And I'm very worried about that.
Richard.
I'll respond to Greg's video of David's question, and that is the role of the state. The state itself, of course, is made up of three key elements. There's a constitutional state, the framework, the legal element, and so on. That can be contested, that can be debated, but nevertheless it's important. The second element is the administrative side of things, which has hugely developed lately, the managerial state. It's lost the political ability for people to talk about representation, participation, of the sort you mentioned, but the key point in that second level, where government is formed, we've lost countervailing powers. We've lost the organised trade unions, we've lost the weak political parties are becoming shells of each other. So in other words, the administrative state colonises the constitutional state, and that's the huge danger. And in the US, if I may be allowed with is that we have, and not just there, of course, there is this enormously developed third state, which is I don't use the term deep state, but I want to say there's a national security state which developed after the Second World War, and at the end of the Cold War, it was not dismantled. And this third state is almost determining both the second and the first. And in part, it ties into the first question, the first comment, is that it's not just countervailing powers and interests and organised in various forms. It's also the intellectual atmosphere in which is taking place. And the public sphere, which used to be, marvellously Adrian described earlier, all these mutual societies. We remember those workers' educational authority, which I used to be very active in the good old days. It's all gone. It's all gone. Workers learning, they would come on the weekend, they would come in the evening, and then they would go and be active citizens. Today they'll be scrolling down no more than 2 pages, of course, in their mobile phones, and that's it. So in other words, where can this be? The debate and intellectual life and the public sphere, which structures the debate, and so on. There's no debate. It's now it's all bonding of particular communities. Facebook does it. Targets it. Dominic Cummings, you mentioned, the Svengali of our times. It's amazing targeting. Trump did it in 2016.
Yeah, just before, Eugene, if I may, just to add to this by saying, you know, what about the academy? That's also disappeared as an independent, or at least set of institutions, been completely absorbed into the market of the state. It's lost its intellectual autonomy, and that also means that we're now producing a generation of graduates who are not intellectually formed,
That's right.
who are simply, you know, inculcated with transferable skills, which are barely employable, which is the other, catastrophe. There are very few graduate jobs to cater to them. So I mean, the whole thing is, in that sense, you know, a lot worse than perhaps we are sometimes prepared to say.
Utopianism is essential.
Well, absolutely. I mean, certainly anarchism in the sense of resisting the totalizing power of state and market, and indeed utopianism as, you know, something to give hope again.
That's right.
Maybe not optimism, because that's shallow.
Yes,
You know, but hope that things could be different if we organise.
One of the things that Telos can do is to prophetically deliver the bad news. That's actually a very deep point. You see, because when most stuff is simply mindless, right? I'm not going to scroll 3 times. One of the important moral functions of the intellectual, you know, if it is to tell the truth, is to deliver the bad news that the cavalry's not coming. And then I think the larger deal, which can put Telos on some extraordinary footing, is to develop a broader view of the world. The game has changed globally. You read the press, no one is educating this country on how the game is changing, right? So there is I think, a unique opportunity for someone to be able to bring the bad news, which is the role of the prophet. The prophet brings the bad news, right? That's extremely important. And then back to the religion thing, it's extremely important that Telos seize the opportunity to educate the world and its readership about religion. The religion game, there's Islam. There is a civilizational war in Africa that is not being reported, where the Muslims are trying to kill the Pentecostals. The war in Nigeria is out of control. And so you've got a triangular thing going on. Nobody understands it, and it'll have profound ramifications for this country. But being typical American, this is a deep thing for Telos to sort of do an inventory. The typical myopic, almost classically American ignorant view of not understanding the world, big picture. Which is why, in Iran, they didn't see it coming. So there's some strategic opportunities to speak prophetically, to deliver the bad news, and to report on the state of the world. Because in that sense, you provide a leadership, you can perform a leadership function. Because, and if Telos isn't doing it, then it's almost like the game's over because there's nobody else out here to do it.
2 questions. First, Donna, and then.
So, just one thing, because Columbia forced me recently to go to a training to understand how to communicate with Generation Z. And I just couldn't take it, I couldn't take it here. So we were at Columbia, at the law school, and someone was telling me that Generation Z cannot really focus. I'm at Columbia, those people really focus. So I just want to say that they're exceptional young people. And we cannot generalize the youth as not being able to focus. I think they're exceptional because if you don't give something to them in the first 3 screens, they are moving on. Because there's so much out there, but don't think that the young people cannot read the tomes. And they are exceptional, and I work with them. I teach at Barnard, I work with those women. They are fantastic. In addition to my own 2 daughters, of course they are fantastic. fast. No, so the youth, I have tremendous faith in the youth and their ability of just cutting the BS. And I think that's what that young man or woman was trying to tell you, rather that if it's not the first 3 screens what he's after, he's going to move on. But I don't think he was telling you that he doesn't have the ability, especially at Harvard.
No, of course. He's not
I'm
saying
only
that.
an
No, that's
LLM
not what I'm
from
saying.
We're
Harvard,
not saying
so I
that,
know
no,
Harvard.
no.
So, no. As opposed to what Wayne, I'm sorry, Wayne, yes? I agree with you that if we are on the left, I think we have to be much better than people on the right. And if we say something, we have to be able to stand up for whatever we say. We cannot be easily contradicted because we didn't do the fact checking. We cannot be in a position that we are worse than 45. We have to be better. It's about role models. Indeed, we have to do our homework, and when we stand up, I agree with you, we have to be very solid in our presentation of our ideas, because just because we are good-hearted people doesn't really matter. We have to provide the goods. So that's all I'm doing with my anger. I just, I'm learning how to chill.
Anger management in public.
Yes, Adrian.
This is just a quick question. Listening to this discussion and many of the presentations before, starting from the very title of the conference itself, I kind of hear an opposition between the state and mutual aid or civil society activity, even anarchism. Is this opposition a little bit uncritical? Because this is what the state itself is calling for all the time. Mutual aid, civil society participation, activation policies are everywhere. This is true of all European welfare states, and this is also true in the United States. So, I mean, how much do we need to stick to this opposition, or would it be worthwhile to look into it more critically from a distance?
Right, Marcia, and then we'll go to others.
I'm going to bounce off something you said. You said nobody's sort of educating stupid Americans as usual. I actually think many people are educating the stupid Americans. Donald Trump is educating the stupid Americans. Every tweet educates the stupid. Mitch McConnell is definitely educating stupid Americans. Facebook is educating stupid Americans. The alt-right is educating stupid Americans, et cetera, et cetera. There's a long list. And the question again comes with, down to with what? And the same point that we talked about during the break. With what are you active? With what are you participating, etc. There's a small library of books written by some very good economists that represent in various ways that reasonable people can discuss many of the goals that Adrian and other people here have suggested. And they are not implemented because they are not understood. There is no popular will and no political will, and that is not being educated to the American public. But other things are, right? And you can say the same thing about guns, whereas Tim, things are being educated and reinforced. But what? And then you really have to, and that is why I said to you, the content of religion, or the content of Pentecostalism, or the content of belief systems involving guns cannot be erased.
That's right.
Right? You actually have to stand up, not only and not be contradicted on the facts, you have to, and maybe Telos has a role here, in articulating specifically the worldview that motivates the actions you are teaching.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
David, and then we'll questions that have been asked previously.
So I guess as a response to Pekka.
No, but please go ahead. You're not on the panel, but you are now.
Paul Piccone had this idea called artificial negativity, right?
Yeah.
And basically that's what you're describing, right? Is the the administrative state needs to have this sort of negativity, otherwise it destroys itself essentially, and so it's always looking for these sources of citizen protest and action in a sense, right? In order to be able to kind of monitor itself and sort of adjust itself. but you know, the way he described it, it's this sort of closed circle where, you know, you're kind of producing this artificial negativity rather than anything real that would actually change anything, right? So you just got a kind of continuation of this loop. And it's been going on ever since Paul was writing about it, you know, it was like in the beginning in the 80s. And you know, I think the first step in kind of you know, destroying that circularity was the election of Donald Trump, right? Because he was the one that really said, look, you know, he mobilized people that had this sense that this sort of bureaucratic apparatus was just sort of running on itself,
Right.
and there wasn't anything new going on.
Right.
I mean, unfortunately, he hasn't really been in the position to really change that dynamic, right? But I mean, I think he's popularized, you know, Piccone in a sense, right? and artificial negativity. It's just that now we have to think through, okay, and so these other, I guess you could say, movements. You know, I mean, I think there's movements. You know, what Tim was talking about with the gun sanctuary, right? Sounds crazy, right? But it actually is not. I don't think it's an example of artificial negativity. It's something that, you know, the managerial bureaucrats can't stand, right? It's not something that they, you know, are somehow able to somehow integrate into the apparatus. And so that's where I think we got to kind of start thinking about it as a different direction.
Yeah, I mean, when we next go out to get endorsements for Telos, we know where to look now. So that's good news. Eugene and David.
One of the things I think is interesting to pick up on the business, let's say at Columbia, one of the things that one of the things I want to encourage us to resist is the temptation. I take your point, they're obviously bright kids, I get all that, right? But I listen to young people, and the tough views that I was articulating come from young people, the smartest of them. The smartest of them say, there's a shallowness about our culture. We're ambitious, right? We're ambitious, we're competitive, and at the elite schools, it's really, you know, right? You know, and what was significant, because the view that I've articulated is one I got from them. The most discerning of those that I meet has a very sophisticated skepticism about the romanticization of youth. They said, this romanticizing youth is an old game, right? He says, every generation romanticizes youth and is optimistic about the future because there's certain kind of moral essentialism which is tied as an ontological category to the fact that you're 19 or 20, all right? And what's deep, you know, and it's fascinating. The sharpest of the young people, right, say, let's stop talking this foolishness. You know, some of our folk are decent, you know, they're good people, they're virtuous people, and a lot of them are losers and very, very ambitious. And the adult said, resist the temptation. And one last point, he says, you guys did that with the Obama thing. You know, young, fresh, new generation, there was all this garbage about this guy who was, as my one friend put it, he was 165 pounds of pure ambition, and it was airbrushed, and oh my God, new age. I mean, all of this bullshit, not true. And just not true. This dude just, you know, and so we have to have Telos. One of the virtues of the Telos thing is that you are able to be a counterpoint to a lot of garbage. When people were celebrating all kinds of stupid versions of Marxism, right? The business, the British business, the French stuff, new this, no, that's all bullshit. Piccone, God bless Piccone, right? And you know, and I love this dude, I never knew him, right? Right. There must be And in some sense, conservatives are good on this. They say, all this new garbage, you celebrate the new. That's stupid. Sometimes it's good, most times it's mediocre. What's it like life? And so I want to resist the temptation for the adults to hand the prison over to the inmates. The young inmates.
Okay, David.
Thinking about
Catherine has to leave, by the way, so we'll just.
Right, no problem. Bon voyage, safe travels.
I'm sorry.
Buffer line. Picking up a little bit on Richard's and also sort of the notion of internationalism. Talk of sort of the state, this kind of philosophical and for us sort of structural category could probably benefit from more flesh on the bones, and in particularly bureaucracy, which is something that I think is deeply under theorized, is gestured towards rather than engaged. And as we think about problems, while mutual aid is great and authenticity is lovely, I gave a bunch of talks that I sort of grouped together called Confronting Rousseau. Right? We do have these problems that are also really, really scaled. And part of the contemporary predicament, I think, is living in a very, very large world, which is kind of inherently structurally alienating, and yet having to find some way to do collective action in that. And we have 2 or 3 ways of doing it. One is called markets. Another is called bureaucracy. And those things are not going away. So one of the things that maybe, just in terms of ideas for future conferences or something like that, and I think, again, it would be very easy to internationalize, is think about what do we hope from, what do we want, other than a sort of Kafkaesque gesture from bureaucracy, because we're not going to talk seriously about any problem like keeping planes from falling from the sky or global warming without getting a whole bunch of smart young Harvard Business School people in a room to do what we used to call policy.
Right.
And that doesn't save us all, but unless we can come to some modus vivendi, or at least peace with that, this notion that we will all go out and join gun groups, I think is, I've spent a lot of time in Colorado, everybody asks me, why aren't you better armed? I spew full arrogance, I still think I'm dangerous, but I realize now I need tools. But so this sort of revulsion against the state that we see thing in sort of like the free man movement and so forth and so on. I think is a big part of how the current president got elected, right? So how do we make our peace with bureaucracy might be something to think about.
Okay, I think we're going to go around the panelists to see first whether they would like to give us some final conclusions, but we do want to wrap up fairly soon. So whoever on the panel would like to speak to any of the comments. Okay, very briefly, but please.
I just want to make a comment about this discussion about the youth being able to digest longer bite-sized information. I believe that ties into Mr. Arya's comment about ability to live with uncertainty. So they want short bites, very precise things, and then if it goes beyond that, they're losing interest. I believe this is the thing we have to focus on. I'm not saying it happens all the time. Sure. I'm just saying that ability to see many different sides of the issues are what's missing a little bit. I don't know.
That's right. Thanks. Okay, so why don't we go through? We'll start with Richard.
It was interesting when Marcia was listing the agents who were educating. No one from the left, as we used to call it. No, it was all behind. And I think that indicates precisely the issue, that there hasn't been, whether we use the term left or right, let's use it symbolically, that there hasn't been the articulation both in policy and debate and hegemonic, even establishing ideas. Bernie Sanders is starting to do it, and some others are doing it. And look what happened to him last time. And that ties in exactly with the state, and this is what David's just said. How do you not just articulate alternatives, but then give them policy and force and institutional dynamic? I mean, Bernie Sanders is an independent, affiliated with the Democrats, but where's his movement? Apart from all his tweeting and Obama had it, where was the movement of actually saying? So it took Trump finally to say this sort of stuff. Sometimes, some of it needed to be said, including about the endless wars, for example. And I do insist again on that third level of the national security state. Maybe it doesn't look like it from the inside, but from outside, guys, it's big and it's dangerous. And when we have tanks trundling through Europe again, I get alarmed. I mean, it's been 30 years of a lost peace. We're just, we're back to where we were. And so that's precisely why the managerialism isn't adequate. I mean, the gentleman at the back was asking about this, is that when people are saying do it yourself, it's basically dismantling the welfare state. It's basically a program, look, we're not going to do it. And of course, the Koch-brothers and all the others, Mercer, Rebecca Mercer, and so on. This is what they're all about, the paleo-conservative, the Virginia School, and so on. It's all about dismantling. And of course, the Russians and others would just love to have Steve Bannon dismantling the administrative state.
Yeah.
The administrative state is our protector. If we can work and shape it and work with it with organised countervailing forces, then it's not, we can work with it. But indeed, so the question is ultimately, what sort of state? And where does political contestation and organised countervailing powers feed into it? Okay, Marcia.
Yeah, so this directly bounces off of your remarks, right? That it's not capitalism and it's not bureaucracy, it's not finance. There are these, I'm picking bugaboos of it's how they are structured. Right? So when you say it's not the state, what kind of state? It's not the administrative state, but how is it structured and for what telos, right? For what telos, or for what policies, for what purposes. Sometimes I shock my students all the time and I say, well, it's not capitalism. Capitalism has many, many ways in which it can be structured. It can be structured with subsidiarity. It can be structured with mediating institutions and so on. And the same thing applies to administration. How is it structured? And that will emanate from, my drum banging. That will emanate from the way people think the world works, such that you structure things in this way. And we need to do that. We need to do that work, so that it's not only the alt-right and Steve Bannon that is educating America or anybody else. Steve Bannon runs all over the world, and the alt-right is not a national institution, it's an international network. So that's where we need to do the work.
Wayne.
I agree with everybody else as usual, but I think we need to be a bit braver, because I think this is really an enlightenment moment. Human beings don't solve their problems, they have to be told what the solutions are. And the people who tell them are small in number, and they're in very small parts of the world, and they often know about each other. This is an enlightenment moment. We need a new generation of enlightenment intellectuals to tell people how freedom is possible. Because we're losing freedom all the time, because there are no intellectuals with a coherent philosophy of freedom. No one in America has a coherent philosophy of freedom. There is no really important philosophy in America at all at the moment, in either Princeton, Harvard, or Yale. There's no one of world-ranked writing philosophy in America. And this shows you the core problem. It's not a problem to be solved by intellectuals, idealists, and we all agree on that. But you have to have concrete examples, and you have to have education programs. But behind them, you have to have a coherent idea. And the coherent idea is a new philosophy of freedom, which, as Richard is pointing out, is institutionally thick. It's not just voluntarism, it's not just negative liberty, it's positive liberty with realist institutions. It's not just a bit of federalism and a bit of pluralism and a little bit of anarchism on the side, friendly societies. No, it's telling people that all real freedom is embodied institutionally and physically, but you have to have a coherent philosophy of freedom. And to end where I started the conference, you can't do that unless you reconstruct social noetic. And no one in America knows what I'm talking about, and that is the problem.
All
We're happy.
For me,
This is a gay couple.
that's right. For me, Yeah. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Great. Well, before we thank the panel, can I just once again thank, first of all, the team that set this up, so Mary and her colleagues, David, who was instrumental in doing the program. All of you who've given fantastic papers, and please do work them up into full submissions and send them in. That's definitely what we want to get from this as well. And so, yes, please join me in thanking our fabulous panelists.